They say that when an empire begins to die, it does not fade away quietly into the night. Instead, it lashes out. It thrashes violently, like a wounded animal backed into a corner, desperate to prove that it still has teeth, that it can still bite, and that its roar still commands the obedience of the world. What we are witnessing today in the streets of Caracas is not a display of strength. It is not the confident projection of a superpower securing its interests. It is the terrified, chaotic reflex of a dying hegemon that has realized, with sudden and absolute horror, that it is losing control of everything. Just 48 hours ago, the United States Navy, the most expensive and technologically advanced fighting force in human history, was humiliated in the open Atlantic by a bucket of paint. I am referring, of course, to the Bella 1 incident, where a Venezuelan tanker evaded the mighty U.S. Coast Guard simply by hand-painting a crude Russian flag on its hull. That moment was a singular defining image of imperial impotence. It was the moment the world laughed. And for an empire built on the perception of invincibility, laughter is far more dangerous than any missile. Washington could not let that stand. The psychological blow was too severe. And so, in a fit of rage and strategic panic, the Pentagon has launched Operation Simon Bolivar, raining missiles down on Venezuela and seizing President Nicolás Maduro in a dawn raid that violates every norm of international law. I am looking at the footage coming out of Caracas, and I do not see a strategic masterstroke. I see desperation. I see an administration in Washington that has failed in Ukraine, failed in the Red Sea, failed to contain China, and is now lighting its own backyard on fire simply to distract us from the ashes of its foreign policy. We must understand this event not as an isolated military operation, but as a historical inevitability in the collapse of the American century. To understand why American paratroopers are landing in Venezuela today, we have to go back to 1823, to the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine. For over 2 centuries, the United States has operated under the arrogant delusion that the entire Western Hemisphere is its private property. Latin America was not viewed as a collection of sovereign nations, but as a backyard, a resource depot, a plantation aimed at serving the interests of the North. When a leader in this region dared to prioritize his own people over American corporations, he was removed. We saw it in Guatemala in 1954, in Chile in 1973, in Panama in 1989. The CIA and the Pentagon have a long, bloody resume of overthrowing governments south of the Rio Grande to maintain this illusion of absolute control. But this time is different. This is not 1989. The world has changed, but the men in Washington are still reading from a script written during the Cold War. They believe that by kidnapping a head of state and bombing military installations, they can reset the clock. They believe that a show of shock and awe in Venezuela will make the Russians back down in Eastern Europe, or make the Chinese hesitate in the Taiwan Strait. This is a fatal miscalculation. The bombing of Venezuela is not a sign that the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. It is proof that the doctrine is dead, and the U.S. is trying to reanimate a corpse. Think about the timing. Why now? Why, after years of sanctions and failed coup attempts, has the U.S. decided to invade directly? It is because the mechanisms of soft power have completely evaporated. In the past, the U.S. didn't need to invade. It could just pick up the phone. It could use the IMF to strangle an economy, or the CIA to bribe a few generals. But Venezuela, despite crushing poverty and mismanagement, did not collapse. It pivoted. It turned to Moscow. It turned to Beijing. It turned to Tehran. The capture of Maduro is intended to be a trophy, a symbol of American resolve. But to the realist observer, it looks remarkably like the desperate gamble of a gambler who has lost every other hand. By escalating this conflict to kinetic warfare, the United States has walked into a trap of its own making. They have confirmed the worst fears of the global South, that no nation is safe, that sovereignty is a myth, and that the U.S. will tear up the UN Charter the moment its pride is wounded. This invasion destroys any lingering pretense of the rules-based international order. You cannot preach about sovereignty in Ukraine while launching an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign nation in South America. The hypocrisy is no longer just a diplomatic annoyance. It has become a strategic liability. This operation exposes the fundamental weakness of the current U.S. establishment. They are reactive, not proactive. They are responding to humiliation with violence because they have no other tools left. The Bella 1 tanker showed the world that U.S. sanctions could be bypassed with a paintbrush. It showed that the fear of American power is gone. And once the fear is gone, the empire is finished. What Washington fails to grasp is that by turning Venezuela into an active war zone, they are not securing their backyard. They are opening a new front in a global war. They are already losing. They are stretching their military resources even thinner at a time when they are critically overextended. We are watching the classical tragedy of imperial overreach. Just like Rome, just like the British at Suez, the American empire is mistaking motion for progress and violence for power. They believe that capturing one man will stop the structural shift of global power. But history teaches us that when you cut off the head of a movement driven by nationalism and anti-colonial sentiment, you do not kill the beast. You create a martyr, and you invite other great powers to step in. This is not the end of the crisis in Latin America. It is the beginning of a catastrophe that will likely drag the entire hemisphere into the chaos of the multipolar transition. The bombs falling on Caracas are the death knell of the unipolar moment. The invasion of Venezuela is, at its core, a confession of economic failure. For over a decade, the United States has waged a silent, brutal war against Caracas, not with soldiers, but with spreadsheets. The Treasury Department, operating from comfortable offices in Washington, deployed the most powerful weapon in the modern imperial arsenal: the sanction. The strategy was simple and cruel. By cutting Venezuela off from the U.S. dollar, by blockading its oil exports, and by seizing its foreign assets, including the shameful theft of Citgo and the gold reserves held in London, Washington, intended to starve the population into rebellion. They believed that if they made life unbearable enough for the average Venezuelan, the government would collapse from within. It is the modern equivalent of a medieval siege where you surround the castle and wait for the people inside to run out of food. But the siege failed. The walls did not crumble. And this is what terrifies the architects of American foreign policy more than any nuclear weapon: the realization that the world has learned how to survive without them. The Bella 1 incident was not just a maritime anecdote. It was a symptom of a much larger systemic breakdown of American coercion. It represented the Ghost Fleet, a massive shadow armada of hundreds of oil tankers that now roam the world's oceans, entirely outside the reach of Western insurance companies and maritime law. These ships do not trade in dollars. They do not use SWIFT. They operate in the gray zones, moving millions of barrels of oil from sanctioned nations like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia to hungry markets in the East. Washington built a cage, but the global South built a tunnel. When the U.S. blocked Venezuela from selling oil to Texas, Caracas didn't stop drilling. They simply turned their ships toward Shanghai and New Delhi. This is the mechanism of circumvention that has rendered U.S. sanctions obsolete. The entire premise of American power was based on the idea that the U.S. dollar was the oxygen of the global economy and that Washington could cut off the air supply to anyone who disobeyed. But nations like Venezuela found that they could breathe just fine using the yuan, the ruble, and even gold. We must acknowledge the role of the great power patrons who made this defiance possible. Nicolás Maduro did not survive this long merely because of his own political maneuvering. He survived because Beijing and Moscow decided that he would not fall. China has poured billions into Venezuelan infrastructure, accepting oil as repayment, effectively creating a barter system that bypasses the U.S. financial system entirely. Russia provided the military hardware and the intelligence support to keep the regime secure against internal coups. When the U.S. tried to isolate Venezuela diplomatically, these powers integrated it into the emerging BRICS architecture. This is a strategic nightmare that the Pentagon ignored until it was too late. By weaponizing the dollar so aggressively, the United States forced its adversaries to create a parallel financial system. They accelerated the very multipolar world they were trying to prevent. Every sanction was a brick in the wall of a fortress built to exclude America. The media narrative in the West tries to paint this invasion as a liberation, a humanitarian mission to save the Venezuelan people from a dictator. This is a grotesque lie designed to manufacture consent. The reality is that the U.S. establishment watched in horror as Venezuela began to recover. Inflation was stabilizing. Oil production was ticking up. The parallel state that the U.S. tried to create with Juan Guaido became a laughingstock and eventually dissolved. The regime change operation had failed on every level. The sanctions were hurting the people, yes, but they were not dislodging the government. In fact, they were strengthening the anti-American resolve of the population. The blockade created a rally around the flag effect where the U.S. was correctly seen as the aggressor. The State Department realized that time was not on their side. Every day that Maduro remained in power was another day that proved the U.S. could be defied without consequence. It proved that the king of the world had no clothes. This brings us to the immediate panic that triggered Operation Simon Bolivar. Intelligence reports likely confirmed what geopolitical realists have known for months. Venezuela was on the verge of formally hosting advanced Russian military assets, perhaps even missiles, mirroring the NATO expansion in Ukraine. The Bella 1 tanker was just the tip of the spear. The prospect of a fortress Venezuela, a Russian-backed, Chinese-funded, sanction-proof state sitting atop the world's largest oil reserves right in America's backyard, was unacceptable to the deep state. They realized that their economic weapons were duds. They realized their diplomatic isolation was a fantasy. And when an empire realizes it has lost its leverage, it reverts to its most primal instinct, brute force. They invaded because they had run out of other options. They invaded because the system, the complex web of financial and diplomatic control, had finally and irrevocably failed. We must now confront the most dangerous weapon in the American arsenal, not the aircraft carrier, not the drone, but the narrative. The moral trap. Every time the United States prepares to crush a sovereign nation, it wraps its iron fist in a velvet glove of high-minded rhetoric. They never invade for oil, they invade for freedom. They never capture a leader to secure a geopolitical flank. They do it to restore democracy. We are hearing this same tired, blood-soaked script play out regarding Venezuela today. The State Department spokespeople, with faces of practiced concern, tell us that Operation Simon Bolivar is a humanitarian necessity. They tell us that Nicolás Maduro is a tyrant and that the bombs falling on Caracas are actually seeds of liberty. We must reject this lie with every fiber of our being. We must look at this intervention not through the lens of CNN or the BBC, but through the lens of history. And history tells us with absolute clarity that American liberation is a death sentence. Let us look at the graveyard of nations that believe the American promise. Look at Iraq. In 2003, we were told that Saddam Hussein was the ultimate evil, a threat to the world, a dictator who gassed his own people. The U.S. invaded to bring democracy. And what was the result? 1 million dead civilians, a society fractured along sectarian lines, the rise of ISIS, the complete destruction of a modern secular state. The oil, of course, flowed freely to Western markets, but the Iraqi people were left to rot in the ruins. Look at Libya. In 2011, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama told us that Muammar Gaddafi had to go to protect civilians. They bombed the richest country in Africa back into the Stone Age. Today, Libya is not a democracy. It is a broken wasteland ruled by warlords, where human beings are openly sold in slave markets. This is the legacy of American benevolence. This is what Operation Simon Bolivar promises for Venezuela. Not freedom, but the silence of the grave. The moral hypocrisy on display is staggering. The United States claims to care about the suffering of the Venezuelan people, yet it is the United States that caused the suffering. Who destroyed the Venezuelan currency? Who blocked the import of insulin and cancer medication? Who seized the state's assets so they couldn't buy food? It was Washington. To strangle a nation for a decade, to force its children to go hungry, and then to invade it, claiming you are there to save those same children. This is a level of cynicism that borders on the demonic. It is the logic of the arsonist who burns down your house and then expects to be praised for calling the fire department. They break the legs of a nation and then offer it a crutch, demanding eternal gratitude and total submission in return. We must also understand the specific economic predation hiding behind the mask of democracy. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, larger than Saudi Arabia. It has gold, it has coltan, it has massive hydroelectric potential. In the eyes of the U.S. establishment, it is a crime for these resources to be under the control of a government that does not take orders from Wall Street. The freedom they want to bring to Venezuela is the freedom for ExxonMobil and Chevron to extract that wealth at pennies on the dollar. It is the freedom for Western banks to privatize the state's assets. When they say they want rule of law, they mean a law that protects foreign capital, not the Venezuelan citizen. We saw this in Syria, where the U.S. occupies only the oil-rich regions, leaving the rest of the country to starve. We are seeing it now in Latin America. The capture of Maduro is not about justice. It is a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a military operation. Furthermore, this intervention reveals the intellectual bankruptcy of the West. They cannot conceive of a world where different political systems coexist. Their definition of legitimacy is circular. A government is only legitimate if it serves American interests. If a leader is popular, if he wins elections, but he opposes U.S. hegemony, he is labeled a dictator. If a leader is a brutal tyrant, but allows U.S. bases and U.S. corporations, he is labeled a strategic partner. This double standard has destroyed the moral authority of the West in the eyes of the global South. When the U.S. ambassador stands up at the UN today to justify this aggression, the rest of the world will not hear a defense of human rights. They will hear the desperate plea of a fading empire trying to secure resources by force because it can no longer compete economically. The consequences of this action will be catastrophic. You cannot bomb a country into stability. By decapitating the Venezuelan government, the U.S. will not create a Jeffersonian democracy in Caracas. They will create chaos. They will fracture the military into competing factions. They will unleash a civil war that will spill over into Colombia and Brazil. They will create a refugee crisis that will dwarf anything we have seen before, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps in their cynical calculations, the strategists in Washington prefer a chaotic, broken Venezuela to a strong, independent one, allied with Russia. If they cannot control the oil, they will ensure that no one else can either. This is the moral trap. The realization that for the U.S. empire, the destruction of a nation is an acceptable price to pay for the maintenance of its own primacy. If the strategists in the Pentagon think that this invasion ends with the capture of one man, they are delusionally mistaken. We are not watching the end of a conflict. We are watching the lighting of a fuse that leads directly to a global powder keg. The response from the rest of the world will not be measured in angry press releases or UN resolutions. It will be measured in asymmetric warfare that strikes at the very foundations of American stability. By invading Venezuela, the United States has crossed a red line that Beijing and Moscow cannot ignore. They understand that if they allow the U.S. to simply topple a BRICS-aligned government without consequence, the alliance itself looks weak. Therefore, the retaliation will be swift, calculated, and devastating, but it will not happen on the battlefield of Caracas. It will happen in the financial markets, in the energy corridors, and in the choke points of global trade. We are already seeing the signs of this global reckoning. China, the world's factory and the largest holder of American debt, views this aggression as a direct threat to its energy security. Venezuela was a key pillar in Beijing's plan to diversify its oil supply away from the Middle East. The Chinese response will likely be economic strangulation. We could see a sudden coordinated dumping of U.S. treasuries, sending interest rates in America skyrocketing. We could see critical supply chains for pharmaceuticals and rare earth minerals being severed. This is the nature of modern warfare. China does not need to send aircraft carriers to the Caribbean to hurt the United States. It simply needs to stop the flow of goods that the American economy depends on. The invasion of Venezuela might secure a few oil fields for Chevron, but the cost will be the collapse of the cheap consumer goods market that keeps the American middle class afloat. Russia's response will be even more kinetic. For Vladimir Putin, the U.S. invasion of Venezuela is the ultimate validation of his worldview, that the West is an aggressive, expansionist predator. Moscow will use this distraction to press its advantage in Europe. With American military resources now diverted to a jungle war in South America, the pressure on the NATO eastern flank will intensify. The oceanic missiles we discussed earlier sitting in Belarus are no longer just a deterrent. They become a leverage point. We may see Russia expanding its operations in Africa and the Middle East, targeting American bases and allies in a game of reciprocal escalation. If the U.S. can light fires in Russia's backyard, Ukraine, and China's backyard, Taiwan, and now burns down its own backyard, Latin America, the great powers will ensure that the U.S. feels the heat everywhere. The era of localized conflicts is over. Every theater is now linked. A shot fired in Caracas echoes in Kyiv and Taipei. The most terrifying aspect of this escalation is the message it sends to the swing states, countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, India, and Brazil. These nations have been sitting on the fence, balancing between the West and the rest. The invasion of Venezuela forces them to choose, and when they see the U.S. behaving like a rogue state, violating sovereignty and kidnapping leaders, they will run into the arms of the BRICS alliance for protection. They will accelerate the de-dollarization process, not out of ideological hatred, but out of survival instinct. They know that if they stay in the dollar system, their assets can be frozen and their countries invaded the moment they disagree with Washington. This creates a feedback loop of decline. The more violent the U.S. becomes, the more the world isolates it, and the more isolated it becomes, the more violent it gets. We must also talk about what this means for you, the average citizen watching this unfold. The mainstream media treats war like a video game, something that happens over there to other people. But in a globalized world, there is no over there. The chaos unleashed in Venezuela will arrive at your doorstep in the form of hyperinflation and energy insecurity. Venezuela sits atop the largest oil reserves in the world. By turning that country into a war zone, the U.S. has effectively taken those barrels off the market for years. The global energy markets, already jittery from the Red Sea crisis and the Russian sanctions, will go into shock. We are looking at the potential for oil to hit $150 or $200 a barrel. This is not just about paying more at the gas pump. This is about the cost of everything: food, transport, heating, spiraling out of control. The Operation Simon Bolivar might be sold as a victory on TV, but in reality, it is a tax on every working-class family in the world. Furthermore, consider the security implications. By decapitating the Venezuelan state, the U.S. is creating a power vacuum that will be filled by non-state actors. We will see the rise of new insurgencies, funded and armed by foreign powers, turning Latin America into a new Vietnam. The refugee crisis will not be contained. Millions will flee north, creating a border crisis that will tear the social fabric of the United States apart. This is the irony of imperial hubris. In trying to project strength abroad, the empire destroys its stability at home. The asymmetric warfare brings the war to the homeland, not with missiles, but with social unrest, economic misery, and political polarization. The invasion was meant to show that the U.S. is still the global sheriff. Instead, it has revealed that the sheriff is an arsonist and the town is beginning to burn. We are witnessing the twilight of empire. The events of the last 48 hours, from the humiliating evasion of the Bella 1 tanker to the desperate, violent invasion of Venezuela, marked the definitive end of the American century. For decades, the world was told that there was no alternative, that the liberal international order led by Washington was the only path forward. We were told that history had ended, but history has returned with a vengeance. The capture of Nicolás Maduro is not a demonstration of power. It is the death rattle of a worldview that can no longer survive in the 21st century. It is the action of a superpower that has forgotten the difference between authority and brute force. Authority is when people follow you because they respect your system and benefit from your protection. Brute force is what you use when that respect is gone. By choosing violence over diplomacy, by choosing invasion over competition, the United States has admitted to the world that it has nothing left to offer but fear. This is the Suez moment for the United States. Just as the British Empire collapsed when it tried to seize the Suez Canal by force in 1956, only to be humiliated by the economic pressure of rival powers, the United States is walking into a trap in Latin America that will expose the limits of its reach. The choice facing Washington was simple: adapt to a multipolar world where power is shared with China, Russia, and the global South, or cling to the illusion of total dominance and burn the world down in the process. Tragically, they have chosen the fire. But fire is uncontrollable. By shattering the sovereignty of Venezuela, they have shattered the remaining trust that held the global system together. They have told every nation on earth that there is no law, only power. And in doing so, they have invited a chaotic free-for-all where every nation will now arm itself, nuclearize, and prepare for war. The myth of American exceptionalism is dead. We can no longer pretend that this empire is a force for good or a unique defender of liberty. It is just another empire, behaving exactly like every failing empire before it paranoid, overextended, and violent. The tragedy is not just for the people of Venezuela, who will suffer the immediate horrors of this war, but for the American people themselves. They are being led into a catastrophe by an elite class that is completely detached from reality. These leaders believe they are fighting to save democracy, but they are actually fighting to save their own ego. They cannot accept a world where they do not give the orders. And because of their pride, because of their refusal to accept the rise of the multipolar world, we are all entering a long, dark winter of instability. The unipolar moment is over. The reality of a divided, dangerous world has begun.